Yeah, nice. From all over. Let's get rocking here. Okay, so as with all our webinars and presentations, I think it's very important that we acknowledge the land that we're on. So in the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, Alchemy Communications, as an inhabitant of Calgary, Alberta, honors and acknowledges Mohkinstsis in the traditional Treaty 7 territory and oral practices of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, as well as the Stoney Nakoda and Tsuut'ina nations. We also acknowledge that the territory we work and live upon is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3 within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. Okay, so for those maybe who are joining us for the first time, welcome. And for those who maybe have been on a few of our webinars in the past, it's good to see some of you again. So anyway, this is just a brief sort of overview of who we are. So Alchemy Communications is a full service marketing PR crisis comms agency based in Calgary. We work with clients from all different kinds of agencies, industries, you name it, we've probably done it, but mainly we're focusing on a lot of nonprofit clients, small to mid-sized businesses, as well as some municipal clients as well. But like I said, we have worked with all sorts of different clients from different agencies and different organizations. So that's great. And I see a comment in the chat, Alchemy is awesome. Well, you said it and not me, so good. But I think we're awesome. So thank you for that. Okay. So jumping right into it, before we kind of get into the 4 Ps as sort of outlined and titled, I wanted to really go back a bit and just talk about what is crisis management. What does that mean? So we often hear sometimes in business, or even if you're on the other side of it, when you're viewing it as maybe someone who's consuming media, you hear crisis situations or crisis communications. And there's different connotations and meanings, obviously, depending on what organization or side of the coin you're on. So when we're looking at organizations and sort of people preparing for crisis communications, that idea around crisis management is really, take the second word, management. So understanding what we're trying to do here. So it's the idea of preparing for, managing, and limiting damages from unexpected and potentially negative events. So the negative event based on your organization or your group, it can be anything from, oftentimes when you see crisis comms, you think worst case scenario, right? Like the worst of the worst. But sometimes they're smaller issues that could be just as devastating for different organizations, just based on what they've identified as maybe being a potential crisis situation. So an example for that would be maybe if you're, let's say you are a car dealership and a customer comes in and just starts losing their mind, and people are recording it and it's going viral and it's becoming an issue, right? So maybe they're venting about poor service, or says, hey, look how I was treated. To that organization, it's a crisis situation. I mean, that situation to a lot would be obviously cause for concern. But then maybe you flip it on the other side, where you're a larger organization or a business that maybe deals in finance, and your data systems are breached and all of your customers' personal information is compromised. So while it may not be as salacious or like visual as something that's going viral, the cause and the root and the reason behind that is of equal, and I would sometimes argue even more important and critical to get a handle on, right? So even though things may not be hitting the airwaves or the social channels right away, that since that would definitely come up, but it's different. The way you gauge crisis is different. So that's an important thing to just keep in your mind when we're dealing with situations and potential crisis issues as well. So that being said, every organization really needs to anticipate, as I mentioned, whatever that threat may be, and develop strategies to minimize those effects and implement those strategies or plans when those crisis situations arise, whatever they may be, right? So that's why I think when we look at crisis management and crisis planning right off the bat, it's one thing to try and like, okay, develop this great plan that has all these steps and things you need to do. But if you don't have a good understanding of the potential issues that you're facing as an organization, that is a huge, you're kind of behind the ball right off the bat. So an example of that, and this is sort of where we come in and we help organizations, because sometimes they don't have a first idea how to start these plans. So if you develop a plan and your scenarios or your messaging doesn't fit with things that are I wouldn't say likely to happen, because anything can happen, but if you're ignoring things that are maybe more likely to happen, and you're just focusing on maybe some things that maybe, for lack of a better term, sound sexier, right? Sound like, okay, huge fire in our building, what do we do? Or huge whatever, right? So it's one thing to really, when you're looking back or starting these crisis communications planning sessions, and as we get into the 4Ps, we'll explain it a little bit more, but it's really about understanding what are the scenarios that are relevant to your business and your industry. And that's sort of where the first thing we do is we really identify those steps. Like what are things that are we likely to face when we're talking about crisis situations? And that can be, we can glean that information from historical information. Maybe there's things that have happened in the past. Maybe there's industry specific things that have happened. Maybe it may not have happened directly to your organization, but it may have happened to a competitor or a person in a similar position. Often in crisis situations, we see individuals that are the main point of it. So it's really about understanding the what is likely to happen, who may it happen to, and then we go from there. So that's just a little bit of a quick little recap and refresh of what exactly crisis management looks like in terms of an organization. And then when you start talking about crisis communications or crisis planning, when you flip it around and you talk about when you're consuming it, if it has gotten to the point where it is hitting either social media or media, it's a crisis. So it's about understanding the level of what you're witnessing and consuming as well. So when we're in that area as the organization on the other side, that's where this crisis communications planning comes in even more, because to the layperson or to maybe someone who's not familiar with the situation or your organization, if they're seeing something that's on social or it's headline news and it's being labeled as negative crisis, it's in their mind, it's the worst top thing. On the flip side, there are those who are interested and would like to learn more information, and that's the opportunity for us to give the facts, the truth. That's where you take all of your planning, and as we see, we'll get into the 4Ps where they come in. That's where you it's make or break time, right? When you start to get into those conversations. So there's a few things. There's people that are hyper aware of it, so that information sharing is super critical for them. And then there's that middle that are just like, okay, I'm concerned, but I don't really understand. And then there's the total in the dark that are just clicking because of it's coming across their feed because it's blowing up, right? So there's different ways to manage that, and we'll get into that as we go further along in the presentation. Are there any questions so far? Okay, and there's a slide here that we are going to open it up for a little bit of discussion. Just if you feel comfortable just chatting putting it in the chat, that's fine too. And if not, we can roll with some examples that I have, but okay, so moving on to the next here, just kind of closing up. And then the reason why I put this slide in again, because I want to reiterate the importance of a great crisis plan. And I don't want to say, I'm not saying great as in it's fail safe and it'll get you through everything. I mean, just the fact that you've created or developed a plan is great, is good. You're thinking in that mindset. So that's one thing I always like to say to organizations is that even if you're thinking that or started it, it's a good thing to have. So good job. Even joining this webinar today is one step in the right direction, right? Because you often hear the term, it's not if a crisis is going to happen, it's when. And that's not just words or writing, that's truth. Like that is actual. If you take anything away from these conversations or reading about crisis comms, that is number one. I cannot stress that enough. Something will happen. And it always goes back to that, what I'm saying about what is a crisis to you. So you may not be in an industry where it's like you're dealing with life and death situations. You may be, but maybe a crisis to you, like I said before, is maybe smaller in someone's eyes, but in yours, it's huge. So it's just about identifying those as well. So one thing that I really like to kind of highlight as this, we have our first discussion point, but then we start getting into the 4 Ps, is that crisis situations, they can come fast, but they can also develop over time as maybe a problem. And I don't like to use the word, I use the word small in this context, but what I mean is that something that's maybe bubbling, and small in terms of, I'm not saying small in terms of the gravity of the situation, but maybe only a few people know about it, or something is just, it's bubbling, right? So if there's situations where you see those warning signs, or you fail to sort of act on it because maybe you don't have a crisis comms plan and you're completely caught off guard and you have no idea, or you maybe haven't identified that as a potential area of concern, or in the crisis scale, when we get further in the presentation, where does that rank? So maybe you just ignore it. And it's not a bad thing. Like, I'm not saying that you should have known this, so this is your fault. It's just, we can always be learning about these things, because crisis, what is a crisis, what isn't, changes from day to day, year to year. Go back 10, 20 years, what maybe is considered a crisis now could have not been there and then, and vice versa, right? So it's really about understanding and planning ahead. And that final point there is that a poorly managed crisis can really lead to full-blown reputational damage, losses, not only financial, but maybe of positions. And there's a legal component in terms of certain situations or crisis, depending on the evolution of it. How much did someone know about it, right? Okay, so got a quick question. I'm just going to hop on to the chat. Thank you to KW. So if the issue is in the media or is on social media, then are you saying it qualifies as being a crisis? That's a good point. Good question. I would say that it is, again, if it has made its way to social and to media, it should be being paid attention. So I wouldn't, depending on the situation, I wouldn't be, again, it goes back to what you deem is a crisis situation, but it is a situation where there needs to be a cause for concern, and some sort of action, whether you've developed it in your plan, needs to be in a response to that and analyzed. So on the flip side to that, not everything that hits could be seen as a crisis, but it also comes into that when we talk about planning, preparation. It's analyzing and saying, okay, does this warrant this type of response that we've outlined in our beautiful crisis plan that I'm going to talk to you about and hopefully help you develop further down the road? But it's really about using a gauge too, because on the flip side, if you treat everything like a crisis, every little social thing or everything that comes up, then it's like, what are we doing? You could be almost creating your own situation in some cases too. So it's really about to understand the situation. And then a following point there, I'd be interested in hearing what you think about the Bud Light situation and how you would have managed it differently. Okay, so yeah, I can definitely get into that. There's going to be a second point for discussion, and I will, now that that's brought up, I'll offer my sort of thoughts and an opinion on that. I think there's always the opportunity to do things differently, but I always like to preface this that I mean, I'm not in the room, I'm not behind the scenes, I don't know all of the details of that. So it's really good to offer feedback, and yeah, I would do this differently, but there's a huge different thing that we need to also take into consideration as well. Okay. So assess it and go from there. Yeah, that's exactly it. And sometimes that assessment process can be sped up depending on sort of what's happening, or even internally, if you're sort of qualifying or seeing things, it's like, yeah, that's totally true, we need to act. So it's assessed based on a number of different factors that I'll touch on as we get going. So thank you so much for those questions. It really helps. Okay, so the first discussion point. So again, if you want to, I'll leave this up on the screen. If you want to put anything into the chat of examples that you had, feel free to, or I can give it a bit and then I can offer sort of an example that I have. But let's just take a moment and maybe think of an example of a time when maybe a small problem, and this could be even your own experience too, when a small problem developed into maybe a larger one because the organization did not see or failed to act on potential warning signs of an issue or a potential issue. So any examples? I'll just give you guys about maybe 3 to 5 minutes just to gather your thoughts and put something into the chat, or if you wanted to share on mic, that's more than welcome to. Okay, I got some. Most problems come because of a lack of communication or a misunderstanding. So clear communication is important, 100%. And I think just to kind of elaborate on that, when we're talking communication and a lack of understanding, even internal, that could be a huge one. I have an example that I'll share. I'm not going to use any organization names, but I'll just use an example. So the situation, basically, there was a small IT outage issue that that was sort of alerted by a user on social media. It didn't really, it was kind of seen as like, it was just not a huge issue. It was just maybe one person having some troubles. Not a big deal. That's what was assumed. So time went on. There was no response, no clarification to that user, nothing like that. So just one sec, someone is joining the conversation, let them in. So yeah, there was no clarification to that user or nothing even internally. Basically the person monitoring just didn't really follow up with it. What ended up happening was that it turned into a larger issue where we started to get at more people, this is happening to me, this is happening. And then it started to spark internal. So it turns out that the issue was known about internally, but wasn't communicated to that person monitoring social. And that what was happening was the organization was in the middle of a bit of a, I shouldn't say middle, it turned out to be a big thing. It was they were under attack, a cyber attack, where systems were being shut down. So what happened there was that this lack of response time to the initial comments on social just exacerbated the situation, because it started to gain traction and people are wondering what the hell, what is happening, what's going on. So as time went on, the longer you kind of go, and then if you come up, what happened was, if there was a message, saying, we are aware of the situation, we're working on it, then the next question is, well, how long did you know about this? Or what is going on, right? So that's eroding that trust that you've built up within your organization. Whereas if there was communication and sort of back to that planning, if you had that scenario planned out where, in the event of potential online interactions that may be cyber attack related, how do we communicate? What do we say? Not saying you post, we're under attack, look out. It's like, thank you very much for your comment. We're aware. We're looking into it. And one thing I always like to say when I'm presenting and talking about this stuff is that it's one thing to say that you were aware, but give the person on the other end a bit of a timeline of what the next steps are. So that I'm not saying that everything needs to be immediate, or I'll get back to you within the hour or whatever. But if you've identified that that's your protocol or your cadence, yes, hour works. Okay. If it's within 4 hours, awesome. If the situation warrants itself, or yep, we'll be looking at the next day. We'll be doing an update at 9 o'clock in the morning. You just communicate that, right? So it's really about filling that, and I just saw a comment pop in here about filling that void of information. That's bang on. So the more you can put that in there and limit that ability for someone to say, well, I didn't know that what they mean by update was 4 hours. I thought it was, you know, I'm ticking here. I want to get something in 15 minutes. Whereas you put that out there, you're transparent. The I'm not saying it's going to fix the situation, but it helps to build that a little bit of that trust equity amongst your audience, or even people that have no idea who you are and they're just kind of tuning in because of this potential crisis situation, right? Okay, is there any other comments before we're going to jump right into the kind of what you've all been waiting for, the P part of it? That sounds kind of weird. The 4 Ps of crisis communications. So if there's anything, throw it in the chat. If not, I will get going. Okay, so when we look at the first P of this 4 Ps of crisis communication / crisis management, the first one here is prevent or prevention. So I really want to preface this with saying that I'm not saying you can prevent everything, but there's things that you can do to maybe mitigate and prevent potential outcomes that could be different in these situations, right? So this goes all the way back to understanding when you're in that development of crisis communications or developing those plans. It's about identifying the potential risks and developing that risk management plan. So what are you identifying as the risks in your organization? What does that look like? Are you more susceptible to cyber attacks? Are you more susceptible to angry customers? Do you interact on a day-to-day basis? Like, it's really about understanding those risk points and the plan around that. Back to sort of that example, and then what that mentioned in the chat there about communication, that is critical. And if I can't, I don't want to start. I'm going to stress this huge. This is communication, or lack of communication is often one of the top reasons for maybe situations spiraling out of control, or even going into that realm of questioning whether it's a crisis or not. That could even go right back to like if we're talking about maybe crisis communications, where maybe some larger organizations do like maybe ad campaigns where it was just off the mark. Well, communication is a component of that, because maybe there was somewhere down the line or chain where it didn't get caught, or someone ignored it, or someone said, hey, we shouldn't really do that. Like, that is a communication kind of disconnect, right? So it's always good to establish sort of those clear communication channels and protocols. And this is going all the way back when you're not in crisis comms, just in communications in general, communications planning. Just establish those touch points of communicating, who to connect with, who has the final approval on things, who writes the messages, who delivers the messages, stuff like that. But in the terms of crisis communications and planning, it's really important to have that protocol established in those channels. Okay, so if a crisis hits, we notice it on social, this is our plan to react on social. These are the messages we use on social media. Who is sending these out? If it's a situation that warrants, an interview or a press conference, who is the person that is delivering that message? Is it your president or CEO? Well, depending on the situation, it may be, but you don't want to be rolling out the top dog for everything, right? So maybe there's some issues where, your VP of operations handles something, or maybe if you're in a municipality situation, it's a council member, or it's the CAO. So it's really about establishing those protocols and those lines of communication for not only developing, but also disseminating and delivering the messages. Monitoring is a huge one when we're talking about prevention, in terms of preventing the gravity of a situation. So back to that example I used, if there was checks in place with that monitoring situation, it could have been caught earlier on, and the warning signs were right there, right? So it's about coming up with those. It's one thing to monitor, but what are we really looking for, and what are we doing if we see something? Even if it's something that we've gotten 4 of these last week, it's nothing. you still need to run it through that sort of that filter test, right? So, because it could develop, it could be nothing, but it could be something. So it's always good to run it through that filter as well. And then the final bullet point, which is critical, important, people know, they only know what they know. They don't know what they don't know, sort of speaking too, right? So if they're not trained or sort of even just brought into the loop of how to recognize maybe potential issues. And I'm not saying you have to do this for every employee, but it's good to identify maybe in the crisis comms planning, okay, well, who is that person that we can identify as someone who's going to be monitoring, and what do they need to know? So identify that person, train that person on what to be looking for. Again, as it relates to your situation, what do they need to, who do they need to report it to? What do they need to say? One example of maybe something that's not filtered out or fleshed out is that you don't want maybe, so someone monitoring or reporting saying, I don't know who to send it to, I'm going to send it to the CEO. Like, I'm just firing it off to the top dog. And that that could be almost like an internal thing where it's like, why are you sending? They may have no idea what's happening. And so it's really good to establish those not only those channels of what to monitor, but those steps in okay, who needs to know about this? So if you see something, you identify, okay, I send it to my boss or supervisor, and then we escalate, or then there's a whole other little next step, right? Because one thing that I also like to mention in these situations is that if you don't want to create your own weather sometimes in certain scenarios or situations, where maybe something was easily averted if you just would have, maybe training could have been better, or planning or tracking, right? Okay. So yeah, as I mentioned, as I just kind of get going into this next slide here, I don't want the message to be that if you get into these and you establish, like, you're clear, if you have everything kind of checked off, your clear protocols, you know, everyone's kind of ticking, we're humming along, it's not going to prevent everything. There are going to be situations that come up, but what it does is it really helps you. I'm kind of jumping the shark on the next tier, but you're planning for that crisis, right? So you're into this next slide here, where we're talking about planning for that crisis situation, right? It's really about, when we say prevent, it's that minimize, do all we can, but this is, if it happens, we're ready. So this is the planning component of that, excuse me, of that situation. So as I mentioned before, so we've sort of identified, looking into the prevention side, we're starting to establish these plans, these crisis management teams, assigning these roles and responsibilities, developing out and building out these plans and what that looks like. I really caution and will stress this. There's a lot of stuff out there where you can get, like, if you just punch in, like, say, crisis communications plan templates, you can get a lot of different resources, and they're great. I'm not saying they're not effective, but you really need to be mindful that this, especially when we're dealing with crisis situations that could impact businesses, in some cases health and safety, you really need to give that a personal touch as it relates to your organization. So just say, for example, if you download something that's, say, 65 pages, and then you look at it and say, I have to fill in every single thing, and this is going to be perfect. Well, I would caution that, because sometimes, just depending on your organization, a tighter, more doesn't necessarily mean better or more effective. So if you look at something, you've identified, you have these things nailed in, and it's only, say, 10 or 15 pages, maybe that works for you. But it's just really about understanding that customizable, how that fits for you and your organization. And I think that's one thing that I really like to do when I work with new clients in terms of crisis planning, is that we start from scratch, we talk about everything, and then we start to distill down what that plan might actually look like. I've done plans that are, like I mentioned, 60 plus pages. I've also done plans that are 5 pages. So it's really about understanding that information that's being distilled down, because the last thing you want to do too, and I've heard this, is that depending on organizations, it's like, oh yeah, we have a crisis plan, it's 150 pages and it's in a binder on my desk and I never look at it. I haven't looked at the thing ever. Right. So that's another thing you don't want. You want to engage with this, and it's a working document. So it's about understanding sort of what you need to have in that plan as well. So when we're looking at that planning, how to plan for the crisis when one hits, it's identify those key stakeholders and develop that plan. So who are we talking to? What are we saying to them? And who's delivering the message? Those are three crucial points when we're talking about stakeholder communication. And that's internal, external, and even audience when we're talking like social. What do people need to know? And then plan accordingly. Sometimes there's this idea that let's just get everything out, just throw it out there. We need a response, just say something. And that kind of goes back to that scenario, creating your own weather, where maybe something you said wasn't completely accurate at that time. It's coming back to kind of bite you in the butt, where a little bit of planning or thinking could have avoided that situation as well. And then finally, that last bullet point is sort of what I mean by prepare backup systems and data backups. It's sort of in the events of when we're in this planning stages, when you're developing, okay, who's going to be doing what? How are we going to be doing this? It's always important to have backup in terms of people, backup in terms of if your website goes down. A lot of organizations have backup sites that they can launch in emergency situations. If it's, situations that your data is breached, okay, so if our plan is online and it's gone, or we have an intranet and our crisis plan lives online, and if no one can access it, then whoa, what do we do? So that's when the backup is that 1994 binder, right? That you have, like, it maybe seems sort of redundant and we're like, everything's digital these days, but it's always good to have that backup plan, right? So that's just a fun little way to think about it. So the third P, the biggest one, I think this is one that's often missed a lot when we talk about crisis communications planning and even developing the plan or anything, right? It's that, okay, we've created the plan. It's this beautiful document. We've had so many people review it and they've approved it and it looks good and we know exactly what to do and and then you never look at it again, or you never review the scenarios, or you never go through the roles. And it's important to build into that plan a structure or timeline around practicing the plan. So I know time is huge for some. Resources is like how many people can actually maybe take a day to just focus on a tabletop crisis exercise when you're trying to manage all these different schedules of people, and it's hard. But I would just say that it is well worth it, because if you're faced with a situation that you've practiced or prepared for, then you're more likely, I shouldn't say more likely, you are ready for that. So the example that I like to use is, I'm a big sports guy, so I think about it this way. So if you run through the playbook where everyone's on lockstep, we know exactly what to do. On the flip side, if someone isn't aware of a certain thing or is out of position, then the play blows up. But there's always this practice component around that, where they just don't create the playbook at the beginning of the season and say, hey, check it out when you can. Like, it's there when we need it. It's like, we'll just flip through it on the day of the game and have for the best. I really like to relate that to crisis columns. I'm not saying you have to look at it every single day, or like in football every week, but if you develop that cadence or your practice schedule, so maybe you're conducting tabletop exercises, every quarter, so 4 times a year, or maybe it's maybe at the onset you want to have more, right? So maybe you're developing them 8 times, doubling up. But it's always good to conduct those simulations and those exercises that are based on the examples that you've developed in your plan that relate to your organization. Because what that does is it gets the wheels going, it gets people thinking in that mode. So when a situation that is similar potentially hits, it's like, oh yeah, that was our exercise. This is holy smokes, like we have to adjust a little bit, but it's pretty close. So on the flip side, if you just never revisited that and you're reading it for the first time and it's like, oh my God, it's just a lot harder to manage. So it's one thing to build out the plan of how to act and react to a crisis, but you should also be planning and scheduling, practicing, right? Practicing those scenarios and those simulations. It goes back to that training component I mentioned about people being on the same page and aware of things. So provide that training and support to the employees on crisis management. Tell them where it is. Don't just, yeah, it's our binder that sits on your desk. It's never touched. It's, yeah, we'll be reviewing that quarterly. If you have any questions, like involve people in the process as well. That's one thing that I tend to find is that if people are more engaged, then they become more invested in it as well. So it's good to really make it fun. It can be a fun thing. I know the topics sometimes are heavy, but if we kind of have a little bit of make it light sometimes, and not saying the situations aren't heavy, but if you can make this training engaging for your staff or even yourself, then you might, it has a funny way of just sticking in your brain, right? It's one of those things that's like, I totally forgot I could do that, but it's just something triggered your memory and it's there, right? So the final point is just always analyze and improve if situations pop up that maybe need to be updated in the plan, or maybe that's a new tabletop exercise, is that analyze those past crisis situations and identify those areas for improvement. Maybe we had a situation where, I didn't identify this I didn't think this would even happen on social media, but it did. Okay. Well, rather than just kind of, we're done, we got through it, build that into the plan for the next iteration, right? Or the next exercise. So one thing I like to do with all my clients and all these certain situations where we're dealing like in the middle of a crisis is always make time for when it starts to subside, whatever that may look like, whether it's a day, a month, some scenarios take years to recover. Set aside that time to review and improve. What are areas, and it's hard because it's sometimes like you don't want to go back to relive those situations that were usually high stress, high emotion. But it's super important when we're talking about that practice component, and even it goes back to all the piece or even around prevention. If you can get a good understanding of what has happened or may have happened or can happen, you're well on that road to success as well. Okay, so the final here, there's two P's in here. So it's sort of that under pressure, the P of pressure, and then the P of perform. So they're two sort of combating scenario, like words, right? When you hear perform and pressure, I don't think there's a lot of people that really bring out their best when and on the flip side, there are that perform well under pressure, but sometimes in stressful situations, there's people fold or wilt. It's like, and I liken that to kind of going back to those P's of that practice, that preparation, the prevention side of things as well. The more you can kind of build up those, you're going to have an easier time performing under those high pressure situations. So it's critical, developing those clear and concise messaging for those different scenarios, that when faced with a similar scenario, it's there. You're not reinventing the wheel. Obviously, you're making some slight tweaks and adjustments based on the information, but it's not new. It's not like, oh, I got to write a statement. What do I do? I have to write a message. These are the sort of the draft templates that we prepared. What can we use? So keep it clear, simple, concise. And this goes back to sort of our key messaging workshops. If anyone has joined us on those, or it's really about making the messages understandable, easy to be recalled. I always like to stick anywhere in between that 3-ish to 5, if 5 is high. But the more you can have something retained in your mind, it's easy. And it's easy to disseminate. It's easy to share. It's easy for people to get on the same page. So it's just one little component of that as well when we're talking about messaging. So when we're in those performance situations or where there's pressure, it's like, okay, we got to go. If the roles and responsibilities of those team members are loose and not defined, that affects the performance from the top. If someone is unclear on their specific role of how they're expected to perform under pressure, you cannot blame them. You can't say, well, why aren't you doing this? Well, I didn't know. So again, it goes back to that training, assign the specific roles. However you define that in your plan, it's really important to key in on that. And it's critical to have that this person is responsible for that, or that position is responsible for this. And if there's overlap, then you talk about that in your review. Maybe it's like, well, we had 2 people monitoring social and there's confusion. Okay, we need to make clear lines on who's monitoring what. Maybe your LinkedIn, Facebook, your Instagram, Twitter. Build, right? So it's one thing to just say monitor social, but the more you get into it, maybe you're identifying deficiencies, right? The third point is sort of what I mentioned before, just again, establishing those protocols for decision-making and escalation. Who needs to sign off on this? When do we need to get it out? And how far up the chain, where does it need to go? Like in terms of the escalation scale, is it something that, yep, straight to the top? Well, it better be checking off these boxes that you've identified in terms of the kind of the framework of escalation. And that's another, if you join us in one of our crisis comms, we talk about more in depth about the escalation framework. And it's quite pretty. It's color coded, blue, red, orange, yellow. So it's a good visual cue of when to sort of escalate things. But if you don't have those protocols, how can you expect to perform at your best? So again, going back to that sport analogy, that football analogy, if you don't have the playbook, hey, that's another P right there. You can't be expected to perform. So it's looping that and bringing that all together just to make sure everyone's on the same page. I do want to say that you might be listening and saying, yeah, Drew, this is all great. This is perfect world scenario. We just don't have the time and energy and efforts. We don't have people, resources to do this. How do we do this? If anything, if you take one thing away from this, it's just start with something, right? So start with crisis comms plan, 1 page, what I need to do. If you're a smaller organization and you're only one person, or I should say one person or organization, but maybe you're only one person in your department of that group, but you've identified crisis comms is good, just start there and then grow. And then the next thing you know, you're saying like, hey, you're making a case for maybe another support person, and the person's like, yeah, that totally makes sense. Come on, let's do it. And then finally, the point here, the last one here is remain calm and focused during the crisis. And I would even say remain calm and focused during the planning of your crisis comms plan. It's easy to kind of gravitate to, like I said, those high stress situations where maybe it sounds cool on paper, but it may not happen. So it's good maybe for an engaging exercise, but if that's all you have in terms of your possible scenarios, I would suggest you go back and maybe focus a little bit more and have that calm lens on it as well. Okay, so in summary, we look at the 4 P's of crisis management, and I think I rattled off a couple more P's, so you could really make it like 6 P's or however many, but these are the main points that you really want to take back and look at, right? So when we're talking about prevention, it's really about identifying the potential risks and taking that proactive measure to prevent the crisis from occurring. Again, preventing, it might happen regardless, but it's to the degree of that, what's happening is where we're really looking at making those inroads. So it's things from, and then if we go right back to even prevention, it's obvious stuff like implementing safety measures, improving, communications, whether it's if you have field workers, right? Like obviously, yes, there's scenarios you can prevent, but in terms of like crisis comms, there's sometimes things they're inevitable and they can be addressed, but it's that degree of things that you need to be aware of as well. So the planning component, develop a detailed crisis management plan that really outlines the actions that you take in different scenarios. And those are the scenarios that are unique to you or your organization. Assign those roles and responsibilities to the best of your ability. If you are a light organization and you find yourself putting your name down for every role and responsibility, maybe you need to tighten it up a bit and say, okay, what do we really need to identify? What I'm the one-man team, what am I doing? Or when do I need to maybe reach out for expertise? Or when do I need to connect with Drew from Alchemy to help? Like, those are all things that should be identified. If you have a larger team where you have the luxury or the ability to pull resources from different maybe departments, that's fair too. Just because maybe the person isn't, like, let's say they're not a social media, that's not their day-to-day job, but maybe they're interested in and they want to volunteer to be part of the crisis comms team and monitor social. On that, the caveat to that is don't forget about the training component. Like, you do have to train that person, right? So that's just one thing around the planning, though. It's about understanding, okay, what do we need to plan for and who are we planning with? Practice. So regularly test and update your plan. Even if it's just reading it, even if it's like, if I know some organizations have a crisis management team or subcommittee, get together and meet on that. If you have a larger group where you can have larger tabletop exercises and really engage, with those people that may not have crisis comms as their day-to-day job, but are on the committee, engage them, right? Have fun with it and really practice and hone your skills in terms of what is written in your plan and what you have in your plan. Because one thing that you'll notice too is that the more you practice, you might be identifying things that you didn't have. So, like, to me, I wouldn't want to be finding about deficiencies in the middle of a real world issue, right? So the more you can look at this and really identify things you improve upon, if it's in the practice stages, awesome, even better. And then finally, perform. So when the crisis hits, remain calm and follow the plan. The plan's there. It's going to work. Our plan is the plan. We can't be questioning or second guessing. That's later. That's after. Maybe we should have done this. But we don't want to get caught in a land of should. We don't want to should ourselves to death, right? Like, we should have done that, should have done this, could have done that. Well, we didn't. We're not. This is the plan. There's time to discuss and kind of dissect as we go. But in this scenario, when you're in that situation, the biggest thing is remain calm, follow the plan. And then those points, just communicate clearly, transparently with all the stakeholders as identified in your plan, and then just kind of go with the flow. Follow the framework identified. So we have 5 minutes here, and I'm just gonna, in conclusion, wrap up here. I'm gonna leave a little bit of time for questions. A few have came in, but if anything, the one thing I'd like to leave you with too is that crisis management, it's a crucial part of any organization's larger overarching strategy. So whether that's a business development plan or a communications plan or a business continuity plan, there needs to be a component of crisis communications and management and how to handle that. But like I said, it's as you get into the weeds of what your organization needs, it's finding that fit for you. So whatever that plan looks like, as long as it's something, it's good. You're well on your way. So anticipation is huge. If you can anticipate and sort of be one step ahead of potential crisis, it's a lot, I wouldn't say easier, but there's more chance for success at limiting that damage. There's probably going to be some level of reputational damage. I'm not going to sugarcoat things. It can be brutal. It can be bad. It can be career ending, business ending stuff, right? So it's about looking at how do we manage that and limit it on a few different things. So the reputational, the financial side, what can we do to maybe mitigate that and limit it? You don't want to be, every situation you're faced with is do or die. You should be like having some of those anticipating and planning those for when certain situations happen. And then finally, the big one here, and I can't stress it enough, the practice that training. Even if it's just like, sometimes it's easy to kind of get pushed off to the side of the desk sometimes, or it's, hey, we haven't met on the crisis plan in a while. Maybe just take a lunch hour to refresh or review, like maybe with your boss, or if you're the boss, maybe with your team, like just go through it and refresh and revisit. There's a reason I kind of joked about that big binder that everyone sees that's collecting dust, and it's like, oh yeah, that's our crisis plan. Well, no one's ever read it. Okay, so it's a joke, but it should, it needs to be sort of refreshed and get some fresh eyes on that as well, because when you need it, you're running right to that dusty shelf, right? You're grabbing that thing. So if it's not up to date, you shouldn't be, it should be expected if you haven't looked at it in years, right? So, all right, so that concludes the presentation for today. I'm going to open it up to some questions. If you do have a question, put it into the chat, or feel free to just hop on the mic. Oh yeah, here we go. The Bud Light question scenario. That is a really good one. So to be honest with you, I don't know how I would have handled that. I mean, I have sort of ideas about how we could all be critics and say how it was managed differently. I think for me, what it goes back to is just that communication component. Obviously, somewhere down the line, there was a lack of communication to whomever, whether it's consumers or audience, or it's about understanding maybe the ideas in the corporate objectives as a whole, right? Maybe that was an issue, right? So it's understanding sort of, okay, did they plan for a potential backlash? And I see a comment here from a strategic standpoint. So was something like that identified as a potential situation? I mean, I'm not, like I said, I'm not in the room. I don't know, maybe it was, but it's about sort of understanding what we need to do and achieve to mitigate that. So strategy is a huge component of that. But I would love to, the person asked the question, yeah, like I could love to have a sit down chat and talk more about it. And even maybe that's a future workshop topic where we dive into real world examples. But one thing that I don't like doing is being too critical of saying, well, they could have done this differently and everything would have been okay. Well, yes and no, right? And I get that there's opportunity to discuss and brainstorm and share, but I would just, I would caution that a little bit, because you just don't know the full side of things, and there's opportunity, there's always opportunity, even if there's a perfect crisis situation that you think you handled perfectly. Someone might say that you didn't, right? So there's always an idea of a way to connect with on that, right? Okay. Is there anything else? Sorry, I'm just sending a response. I will. Okay, so I just put my email into the chat directly to someone, but I'm going to flip to this next slide that has my contact info. So that's me. You can email me, text me, call me, mail me a letter if you want. My mailing address is there, so that'd be great. But anyway, if you want, you can connect with me and I'd be happy to talk more about our topic today. Or if there's anything maybe that you had a question, or any future topics that you'd like to see, or if there's any opportunities maybe for us to work together, I'd love to hear that too. But I would just like to say, I hope you found today's webinar. Yeah, I hope you got something out of it. And we do them every month. So you can find the full kind of calendar of our upcoming webinars on our website. So it's just alchemycommunications.ca. Or we send them out through, we do a monthly newsletter. So we send out communication that way as well. So it'll be included in the newsletter. And then it'll also be included in sort of one-off upcoming webinar blasts. So strongly encourage you to subscribe to that or check out our website for more details. But thanks again. It was a great hour spending with you guys, and hope to hear from you soon. Thank you very much. Have a great day.